This is the lecture for European history for Monday, the 28th of February, 2022. And where we were was Japan had adopted the Meiji Restoration, which was a restoring of the imperial power, but it was also an attempt to modernize Japan. Japan, for the last 250 years, had been under the Tokugawa shogunate, which was a samurai-ruled medieval military government, which had brought about cultural stasis. Now, their stasis had brought peace and prosperity, but it had provided them with no advancement. That was part of the goal, no advancement. And it was their poor luck to have that stagnation, which China, by the way, paralleled for its own reasons, happened at the precise moment when Europe went industrial. So when Commodore Perry of the American Navy shows up with a demand that Japan open up to foreigners, the shogunate was revealed to have failed in its primary duty to serve the God Emperor and protect him. So within a decade or more, the shogunate had been replaced by a new, assertive Japanese emperor who had been a symbol, a figurehead for many, many hundreds of years. Now was going to head up a constitutional monarchy based superficially on Britain, with a Japanese diet instead of a parliament, and the emperor instead of the queen. The result was an army designed by Prussians, a navy designed by the British, an industrial plant largely designed by Americans. What the Japanese did is they took the best from around the world, and they absolutely were committed to becoming more Western than the Westerners. This is something that the Manchu dynasty of China never did. They maintained a contemptuous attitude to Westerners, seeing them as foreign devils, as barbarians. Well, the industrial West was not a bunch of Russian traders in furs, or Mongols, or Sun Nu, or anything else that China had experienced before. The Western traders were more advanced than China, technically. This is the first time in China's history that they had encountered anything more advanced than themselves. And it was something psychologically they were not prepared to deal with. The Japanese, on the other hand, because of the nature of Shinto, the role of the God Emperor, and the realization of their weakness, went the opposite way. Now, if we were to encounter interstellar emissaries from some kind of star empire or republic, the human race would change. Human culture would inevitably change, because at this point we can't even properly do interplanetary travel. We do a lot of work in low Earth orbit. We do occasional interplanetary probes. But we have not yet mastered interplanetary space. And if we encountered some group, people, species, culture, that had not only conquered the interplanetary problem, but that had solved the light barrier, had somehow circumvented the speed of light, and traveled here, we would be in the position of the Aztecs, faced with the Spaniards. We would hope that they wouldn't be unfriendly, but the truth is, unless they were angels, the power imbalance would cause us to adapt more and more of their ways. Some humans, given the psychology of people, would become alienophiles. They would adopt ape probably mimic in ridiculous ways everything they thought of as superior and alien. Other humans would retreat into a form of intense fundamentalism and would refuse to have anything to do with anything from the time of contact afterwards. They would be like the Amish, intentionally regressing back into an idealized early age. It would not be a good experience, or an easy one anyway. China and Japan choose opposite routes. The Meiji Restoration pays off when China and Japan meet in war. In the 1894 Sino-Japanese War, Japan beats China just like the Europeans do. And Japan becomes a power that gets foreign concessions in China, just like the British, the French, the Germans, and so forth, even the Americans. Japan also gets the territories of Korea and Taiwan from the Imperial Chinese, and they get the ability to establish concessions, in other words, places where Japanese rule and Japanese law applies within China's empire proper. Japan is also interested in dominating an area in northwest China called Manchuria, which is where the imperial household comes from that rules China. Manchuria is located north of Korea and northeast of Peking. Manchuria is strategically important because of minerals and because of location. But the Russians crave Manchuria. The Russians have already taken a bunch of Siberian territory from the Manchus in the Amur River region and on the island of Sakhalin. And the Russians intend to build their Trans-Siberian Railroad through Manchuria. So the Russians protest. And the Japanese are diplomacied out of Manchuria, which they're not happy about. So for 10 years or so, there are tensions in the East. Japan is becoming modern, and it is not happy with the way the Europeans are treating it because it's the only non-Christian, non-European great power. Feels like it's taken advantage of. It's an inferiority complex the size of a battleship on their shoulder. They're daring somebody to knock it off. In 1904, the Japanese do something very characteristic. At Port Arthur, the Russian Navy base in northern Korea, actually in southern Manchuria, Japanese torpedo boats launch a sneak attack, heavily damaging the Russian Pacific Fleet. Declaration of war follows the sneak attack. This pattern is typical of medieval Japanese warfare. It's considered to be clever. You take advantage of surprise and of the enemy's distraction and weakness and get an initial advantage, which you can press for the rest of the war. The Japanese then advance northward from Korea into Manchuria. And in a 2-year period, for the first time since the Mongols, an Asiatic power spanks a European power. The Russians fight bravely, but they're poorly organized, poorly led, and the Russian army is defeated on land. Port Arthur becomes a Japanese port. And the Russians, after losing their Pacific fleet in a series of battles after the torpedo attack, decide they're going to send their Baltic fleet. Russia has 3 very separate navies. Remember how important navies are since the book by Alfred Thayer Mahan, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. So, the Russians have a Pacific fleet at Vladivostok, east of Korea. That's gone. They have a Black Sea fleet. That's backward. And they have a Baltic fleet up here near St. Petersburg in the Baltic states. So the Russian Baltic fleet is sent on a journey through the Baltic into the North Sea. But Japan and Britain have a treaty. And the Russians mistakenly attack a number of boats that they see as Japanese torpedo boats in the North Sea. They're British fishing trawlers. The Russian Navy sinks a bunch of British fishing vessels. The British were already unfriendly towards the Russians because of the the fact that Britain and Japan have a close alliance at this point, but now there's blood in the water. So the British are going to close off every one of their coaling stations to the Russians. This is going to incredibly complicate the Russian fleet's ability to move, because ships in those days had fairly short range thanks to their burning of coal. The Germans, on the other hand, who want to benefit from this, step up, and they provide the Russian fleet with a series of at-sea coalings. The Russian Navy proceeds through the North and South Atlantic around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, through the Malay Barrier, up through the South China Sea, through the East China Sea, and in the Korea Strait between Korea and Kyushu are the islands of Tsushima. That is where the Japanese Navy is waiting for them. The Russian ships, built largely by the French, are tall and ponderous, painted in black and white and gold. The Japanese ships are painted oceanic gray, and they were built by the British. The Russian ships are from widely different classes, all thrown together. The Japanese ships are largely homogeneous, built to function as a unit. The Russians have just gone on the longest sea journey that a modern fleet has ever taken. Their ships are filthy with coal. Their machinery is on the verge constantly of breaking down. Their sailors are demoralized, and their admiral is a martinet who cares more about steaming and good formation than battle training. The Japanese are under a very practically minded admiral named Haihachiro Togo. Admiral Togo has trained his ships up to the peak of efficiency. At the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet destroys the Imperial Russian Baltic fleet. I think one or two small ships survive. The rest of the Russian fleet is either sunk or captured. Japan wins. At this point, the American president, Theodore Roosevelt, walks softly and carry a big stick, offers to broker a peace treaty. The Japanese are suspicious because they're afraid of being done out of a victory like they were back in 1894, but the Americans have a special relationship with the Japanese, good and bad. So both the Japanese and the Russians send delegates to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, actually Kittery, Maine. And there, Roosevelt brokers a peace treaty. The Russians, led by Sergei Witte, are absolutely in denial about what the realities are on the ground. They act as if their forces have conducted themselves successfully. They have not. The Russian army has been defeated again and again. The Russian fleet, two of the three Russian battle fleets have been sunk or captured. Finally, it's made clear the Japanese are going to get Manchuria. The Japanese are going to get southern Sakhalin Island, north of the islands of Japan. The Japanese are going to take Russia's place as a dominant Asiatic power. The Russians keep Vladivostok. They keep their Pacific coast. But Japan has become predominant in that area. Still, the Japanese are not thrilled that they didn't get more. The militarists view President Theodore Roosevelt as a man who has taken Japanese trust and betrayed it, because the Russians did successfully keep a bunch of territory on their Pacific frontier. Further, anti-Japanese policies in California and on the West Coast offend the Japanese sense of racial superiority. Instead of being treated like racially superior men, the Japanese are treated like the Yellow Peril, which is a European euphemism for the impossibly large populations of Orientals that could swamp Western civilization. Immigration from Japan is a problem in this period. Californians and others on the West Coast think that they're being swamped by Japanese workers that are lowering everyone's wages, bless you, and threatening the culture. So a number of anti-immigration laws that by today's standards are completely racist are set up. The Japanese are not happy about this. So after the Russo-Japanese War, the Americans decide to do a public relations exercise. We want to show the Japanese and others that we are more capable than the Russians, that we have arrived. After all, we spanked the Spanish around. So we send our battle fleet, the Great White Fleet, on a worldwide diplomacy tour. Unlike the Russians, we're not doing this in wartime. Unlike the Russians, the British are not too hostile. But the fact remains, it is a major logistical accomplishment. A number of people who will later lead the attack on Japan in the Second World War have medals from the Japanese emperor from their time on the Great White Fleet when they visited Japan. America and Japan, from a Japanese perspective, have a love-hate relationship. And the Japanese are focused on the Americans in a way that Red Sox fans are focused on the New York Yankees. Whereas America, being self-involved, tends to look at the Japanese like just another foreign country. So Japan has arrived. Now, before we shift to British India, do you have any questions about the Japanese and their rise? I'll save the history of Japan sort of for later here. Okay. British India is focused upon as the major point of the British Empire after the fall of British North America, after the loss of Britain's 13 North American colonies who rebel and become the United States of America. The British are going to focus on taking the French, for the most part, out of India and on dominating the entire subcontinent. That's what the British call it. And India is a subcontinent. It's huge. Everything south of the Himalayas, east of Persia, west of Thailand and Burma, deep into the Indian Ocean is British India. So British India includes the modern nations of Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Andaman Islands, the Maldives Islands, a number of other Indian Ocean island groups, including Diego Garcia. And right next to it is Burma, which is different from India, but is still contiguous with British India, so it's a part of Britain's empire there. This is a massive chunk of territory that Britain is going to eventually get. One of the key moments in this is Lord Clive at the Battle of Plassey, as the British East India Company beat the monarch of Bombay, freed the prisoners of the Black Hole of Calcutta. You've studied this in a previous unit, so I'm just alluding to it. So the British East India Company is going to produce most of this growth. And what that means is that the company is interested in turning a profit. So India is not set up as an administrative area by government people, by government bureaucrats. India is set up as a patchwork of different compromises. Some parts of India are ruled by local princes. These are called the princely states. Some of them are a city neighborhood. Others are the size of a small European nation, like Switzerland. Others are directly ruled from London. Much of India is owned by the British East India Company. You have a variety of different political arrangements. So as the British manage things in India, they're not managing a single area. It's like people who think of the United States as a single nation. Well, in fact, we're part of a federal system that has very strong states. So in some ways, you can make national policy, but in other ways, you have to make policy at the state level. And this allows states like California and Idaho to be so different from one another. In India, the divergences between one region and another, the diversity, the differences, are much greater than those between American states. This is on purpose. Because the only way an army of about 100,000 British can keep several tens of millions of Asian Indians as part of their empire is through a process of divide and rule. Now, the British start out with technical advantages. Modern gunpowder weapons, industry, and so forth. So, what the British will often do, what the British East India Company will often do, is they'll pick a local ruler who wants more. You want more, Pius, don't you? Just like Oliver, you want more. The problem is, you've got these other states around you, and they're standing in your way. And these other states, well, we don't like them as much as we like you. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide you with British gear for your troops, and British training for your troops, and British money. And you can take over Suslovia, and you can take over Montgomery Land, and you can take over Robinson Town. And now you're going to rule your own little region for us, because it's obvious, and we don't even have to come out and say it. Without us, you'd still be the ruler of Podunk, little boondock backwater. But now you're an important man, and we made you that way. And if you don't play ball with us, we'll make somebody else important instead of you. So this is a system of very, very, very sleazy, you could call it, pragmatic, you could call it, divide and rule, where they back one local leader and conquer all the others with the help of that local leader. But that's not all, because the Indian subcontinent is divided by faith. The majority of India is Hindustan. In other words, it is populated by polytheistic pagans who believe in the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. So unlike Christians, Jews, and Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhism comes out of Hinduism much the same way as Islam and Christianity come out of Judaism. So there is a connection. In Hinduism, later in Buddhism, the soul is the reality of you and the reality of me. The body is simply the clothing that the soul is wearing for a little period of time. The clothing you're wearing today, presumably, is not the clothing you're going to be wearing all week. And what happens is, each day you decide you're going to wear fresh clothing or you're going to reuse the clothes, whatever. But eventually you're going to wear fresh clothing. The soul is moving from moment to moment and is putting on a different body, just like you put on different clothes. Now, the soul's choices in life shape what options they have for the next set of clothes. If the soul is selfish and dishonest and lustful and brutal and all the things that no good religion wants its people to be, the soul's options are going to be wearing a bunch of torn in an unfashionable way, worn out clothing so that you'll look like a bum. You'll get to wear bum's clothing. On the other hand, if you are a wonderful person that is generous and thoughtful, a good leader, somebody who cares about other people, somebody who's compassionate and loving, not Haley, what would happen?
Everybody was laughing because you're like,
oh, it's funny because it's true. Anyway, the idea is.
nobody's disagreeing with him.
Of course they are. They're just. Oh, that's right. Thank you, Portia. Then you get a tuxedo or an evening gown to wear.
I get a tuxedo.
Now, what does that mean? That means that your choices in life in Hinduism determine whether your next life is going to be as a animal, or as a lower caste human, or as an upper caste human, or a Brahmin bull, which is like an angel in beef form. And then above that are the Hindu divas, which are Hindu angels. Now, bulls and cows are sacred creatures. Why? Because they eat grass and they produce milk, which is good for cheese. They are the ultimate pacifists. Cows don't want to bother anyone. They just want to live and eat their grass and mate and make cheese or make milk that you can make cheese out of. And they're just wonderful. They're gifts to the world. So, of course, the highest caste human being is lower than a cow in Hinduism. So, not many beef cheeseburgers sold in the Hindu parts of India because it's blasphemous. They don't do that. They have McDonald's in India, but McDonald's serves these sort of spicy nut burgers. They're sort of like veggie burgers. Yeah, it's about as good as you'd expect. But there's lots of spices, and it suits an Indian palate. By the way, in the Moslem areas of India, obviously you can't have pork. So, Indian McDonald's in mixed religion areas having no access to bacon, to ham, or to beef, they have to be creative, and they are. In any case, there's the Hindu regions, and there's the Islamic regions. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Guess what? You know how Muslims and Jews and Christians don't always get along? Muslims and Hindus don't always get along either. There's a huge history of tension between these groups. In fact, anyone who's dealing with the Islamic world, for the most part, has tensions because the Islamic world is deeply evangelical and does not want to compromise on issues of faith. Now, you may have heard of the Baha'i religion. Baha'i comes out of Islam, and Baha'i is a very pacifistic, feminine-oriented type of Islam. I've had a few students who basically consider themselves to be members of the Baha'i faith. The opposite of that is another offshoot of Islam called the Sikhs. But whereas the Baha'i are pacifistic and sort of feminine-oriented, the Sikhs are masculine-oriented. Every Sikh man takes on the name Singh, which means lion. No Sikh man is allowed to cut his hair, ever. So they've got these massive beards and that's where they wear the turbans. The turbans hold on to their hair. And Sikhs are some of the most incredible warriors in the world. They are a warrior people. They've got a golden temple at Amritsar in the Punjab, which is northwestern India. And the Sikhs end up becoming some of the best soldiers of the British Army. Another group of soldiers who are Sikhs tend to be big beards. They also have the Gurkhas. Gurkhas are little mountain people, about 4.5 feet tall. Gurkhas give us the kukri, which is a Gurkha knife. Looks sort of like this. So you've got the handle, and then you've got the blade, and you swing it like this. That's a Gurkha knife. That's a lousy picture of a Gurkha knife. It should be pointier. But you get the idea. So these little mountain dudes called Gurkhas also become very important soldiers in the British Army because they're just so tough. You can't, even now the Gurkhas are an important part of India's army. So what do the British do with these religions? Well, they play. The Hindus against the Muslims, against the Sikhs, against the Parsis, which are Zoroastrian holdovers, against the small Christian community of Asiatic Nestorian Christians. There also are other differences. For example, there are Bengali speakers, and there are Hindi speakers, and there are dozens of other small language groups. India has been an independent country since 1947. So is Pakistan. Do you know what the official language of India is?
English.
English.
What?
Because the British ruled India for a while. Because English is the global language of trade and diplomacy and air traffic controllers. But also because English is equally alien to everyone on the Indian subcontinent. So everyone has to learn English as a second language, and it's fair. But if the language was Hindi, the Bengali speakers would be Durr! And if the language was Bengali, the Hindi speakers would be Durr! And obviously, if any of the smaller languages, that's just crazy talk. So they kept English. And to this day, now, Indian English is a little different from American English, as you may know. I'm not really great with accents, but if you look at Apu in The Simpsons, oh, that's right, they canceled him. But look at an old episode of The Simpsons, and you'll see Apu now, he's a Petalam, who is the manager of the local Quickie Mart. You know, as if there's no such thing as a person from the subcontinent running a convenience store. That was actually quite normal where I came from. Or watch The Big Bang Theory and listen to Raj, although Raj's accent is very, very, very mild. Yeah.
We at church we had one of our members who has a really thick accent.
Mm-hmm.
And he was about to go to Thailand, and our pastor was like, "I'm going to be up here to translate," just because he has a really heavy accent. And like there were certain things that he said, like evangelize.
Yeah.
Like he could say it. So it's like, I forgot. Like that's all you heard. And so people were like. But it was interesting because the longer you listen, the more you can understand.
Well, yeah, no, and that's the way it is because he's speaking English.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a very different kind of English. It is. Or you can watch a Bollywood film. That's watch Slumdog Millionaire or whatever. You'll get some sense of what people in the subcontinent sound like. So the British play off on differences between the Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, between Bengali speakers and Hindi speakers. Oh, and there are two racial groups. Well, actually two. There are a bunch of racial groups. There are the Aryans in the north. That's the Pakistanis. They're basically Caucasians. They tend to have darker skin than most people in Europe or America do because the sun tends to be stronger. And there are in the south Dravidians. And the Dravidians tend to be darker skinned and smaller physically than the Caucasians do. And that's just two of the many different ethnic groups in India. Shh. So the British play on all of these differences, and it works. It works. The British actually have a very good grasp of control over India. However, in the 1850s, I think 1856, 57, oh God, they screw up. Because there's a new rifle. And there are Hindu troops that use this rifle, among others. And what you do is you get a cartridge, you bite off the end, and you pour out some of the gunpowder into the firing pan, and then you drop the cartridge in, and boom, boom, boom. So there's a new rifle, and you've got to bite the edge off. But they decide they're going to lubricate it. And they lubricate this thing with beef tallow. Now, in Britain, using beef tallow as a lubricant seems totally reasonable. It's basically beef fat. It's what makes really good French fries, although nobody uses it anymore because it's unhealthy. But it tastes so good. I've never had as good a fry as I used to get from McDonald's when they used beef tallow. Can anyone tell me why this might be a problem to Hindus? Haley?
Holy cow!
Yeah! That's exactly right. There's a problem here. Many Hindus are vegetarians. And those who are not allowed to eat beef. And you're putting in your mouth a cartridge that when you break it open gives you beef tallow that's in your mouth and is being absorbed. That would be like having a weapon that looks like a cross, a crucifix, where to activate the weapon you'd have to spin the body of Jesus on the cross. It would be irreligious, just a bit, blasphemous, yes? So the Hindu troops, when they realized that they've been using this, because nobody told them right away, they just found out, they rebel. It's called the Sepoy Indian Mutiny. And within a few months, the British actually come fairly close to losing India. I mean, all of it. This is bad. So, what happens? Well, the British devote real military resources, and they fight their way in, and they crush the Sepoy Mutiny. They also crush the cult of Kali while they're at it. Now, the cult of Kali, you may be familiar with if you've seen the second Indiana Jones movie.
Yeah.
Because what they are is a murder cult. Kali is the Hindu goddess of chaos. She wears a necklace of male body parts, very special male body parts, around her neck. She has multiple arms, and she is the goddess of murder and chaos. So one of the things the cult of Kali will do is they'll walk through city streets as the sun is setting. And the last person who meets their gaze before the sun sets, the Thuggee, who are the cultists of Kali, the Thuggee will pursue, just walking calmly, quietly, until they get to a place where the person is alone. And then they'll take a rope that's been tied with a Thuggee knot. A Thuggee knot is this big, bulbous knot. And they quickly snap it around their neck and go. Actually, they wrap it so the Thuggee knot is right here, and then they snap it too. The Thuggee knot, if applied correctly, will crush a person's larynx immediately, and the person dies of suffocation in silence. The Thuggee are a murder cult that become very good at this. So, as an ancillary move, the British are continuing to suppress the Thuggee cult when fighting the Sepoys. But for the most part, they crush the Sepoys. But the British realize that the British East India Company can't do this anymore, because they're the ones that are blamed for the cartridge mistake. So the British government takes over directly, and Queen Victoria is made the Empress of India. And from that point until 1947, every British monarch, Queen Victoria, King Edward VII, King George V, and King George VI, are not only King of England or King of the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, but they're also the emperors or empresses of India. Queen Elizabeth II is not, because India was independent by the time she took the crown. So, this is the beginning of what is called the Raj. Now, the word Raj means the empire, ruled by a Raja. And the Raj is the British government directly ruling most of India. But they keep as many of the arrangements of the old British East India Company as possible, and they continue the method of divide and rule. Britain becomes the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, because with Indian resources, the British are able, that's a nice bright red, the British are able to have basically equivalent natural resources to a continental power like the United States or Russia. The British with India combined their small island's ingenuity with okay. So this entire area here is basically British India. It's this massive region of the world, and it also includes most of the islands of the Indian Ocean. And the British have colonies in Africa and in the East, including Australia. So the Indian Ocean largely becomes a British lake. And the British people benefit from having all of the cotton produced in India, thank you, and all of the spices produced in India, and all of the foodstuffs in general. India makes Britain a superpower. So India is the jewel in the crown. Now, any questions on British India before we move on? The scramble for Africa happens when quinine makes it possible for Europeans in large numbers to enter the tropical jungles of the world. Remember, quinine reduces the possibility of you getting malaria. So, The heart of Britain's policy is to control the Suez Canal and Egypt. And to control Egypt, you need to control as much of the Nile as possible. So they want to deny the Nile to any foreign power. So the British march up the Nile. They also march up the Nile in order to cut off the slave trade from Black Africa to Arabia. And ultimately, the British control a band of territory from Kenya in East Africa all the way to Egypt, unbroken. So the slave trade is disrupted to an extent, and the British have control over Suez. They also have control over the entrances and exits to the Mediterranean Sea at Gibraltar, the Suez Canal by controlling Egypt, and the Red Sea by controlling Aden. And that all gives Britain a degree of security and control over its lifeline to India and to the areas east of Suez. So Britain's scramble for empire is at first focused on Suez and Egypt. Now, there are others who become involved in this, particularly there are the famous explorers, Sir Richard Burton and Stanley and Livingstone, and they all work for what's called the Royal Geographic Society. Burton explores inland in what becomes later Germany, East Africa, and then Tanzania. And he is looking for the source of the Nile, which he's told by legends are from what are called the Mountains of the Moon, which is this massive mountain range that people think exist in East Africa. Well, he doesn't find that. He does find the Great Rift Canyon. If you remember your geography, East Africa has this massive rift canyon, much larger than the Grand Canyon. And this rift canyon is its own ecosystem. It's where human beings come from, according to the theory of evolution. We come from near Lake Turkana in the Rift Valley. Burton discovers Rwanda and Burundi and a symbiote society between the Hutu and the Tutsi tribes, where the Tutsi rule, but the Hutu are the ruled, but they need one another. Ultimately, this is going to end in genocide in the 1990s. Burton also discovers Lake Victoria, which is the source of the White Nile. Eventually, they figure that out. Now, Dr. Livingstone is a British missionary who goes into deepest, darkest Africa, what later becomes the Congo, or the Belgian Congo. And he goes where no white man has ever gone before. At some point during high school, you're going to read Heart of Darkness. And in Heart of Darkness, you'll learn about an elephant trader who is who's gone a little crazy up near the source of one of Africa's great rivers. Well, Livingstone does not become crazy. He does disappear from European knowledge. So the Royal Geographic Society sends a journalist explorer after him called Stanley. And Stanley travels up the Congo and he's looking in Central Africa and he's looking for Livingstone. And eventually he leaves where every other white man has ever been. He's in areas that are completely populated by native tribes, deepest, darkest Africa. And then he hears stories about this strange white fellow. And it takes him months, but he eventually finds a mission village where Livingstone is proselytizing and preaching and healing the natives. And with absolute typical British stiff upper lippedness, he walks up to the only other white man in probably 10,000 square miles of territory and says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" That's like meeting somebody on the moon, who's the only other person who could be on the moon. And you say, "Hi, Jerry Jones, I presume." I mean, I'm probably not I'm not telling it well. Where we will continue is on South Africa, or on Africa, and we are making our way through the scramble of Africa to Southern Africa. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Did you know that Belarus is going to be joining Russia in the invasion of Ukraine?
It's because Belarus's dictator is a tool and a puppet of Putin. That's not a surprise. Basically, Belarus's independence is going to be gone. Yes?
Didn't Putin send Belarus already to Ukraine?
Yeah. Belarus
Allowed. Yeah.
Putin put troops in some of their bases near the Ukraine border, and that's where they've stationed.
Yeah. Basically, Putin is making a gambit. I have ideas on how he can be stopped, but it would require Europe to come together, which surprisingly it is. But it would also require the American president to be something other than he is, because what we would have to do is suddenly start producing as much energy as possible. We produce fully oil through fracking and other things, and natural gas, and ship it to Europe, and we collapse Russia's economy, and that is what would hurt Putin, possibly overthrow him. But it requires Biden to do something other than cater to the environmental lobby. Yes?
Most recently, Belarus has essentially gotten rid of a law in their government that makes them non-nuclear power. And so...
Oh, yeah, so Putin's going to try to move
We don't
himself.
know, but that's the assumption.
Well, look, and also Putin has been stupid enough to, again, repeatedly make references to his nuclear program. No, you don't do that. That is not done. It's cheap, amateurish, and it's stupid, because if he employs nuclear weapons, he's going to get hit with them. And he should know that. Then again, he may calculate Biden is so senile that maybe that won't happen. But I think, no, you don't use nuclear weapons without some kind of reprisal. Yeah.
Two things. One, Putin sent 400 mercenaries to kill Zelensky.
And what a guy.
There are...
Well, Putin's also putting thousands and thousands of Russians in concentration camps, or gulags, because Putin did this because he's unpopular in Russia in the first place. Putin, understand, it's like Hitler. The greatest victims of Hitler were the Germans. The greatest victims of Mao were the Chinese. And the greatest victims of Putin are Russians, in that he has been punishing and harming them for 22 years, 23 years. Yeah.
How many people, all the people in his government, are they all very supportive of him? Is that why he's able to do so much? Because if the people aren't, like I watched a video where...
Imagine a group of gangsters takes control of a country. That's basically Putin. Putin is a representative of the KGB, which is the secret police, which still existed in the 90s, and the Russian mafia, which are basically drug traffickers. And they together combined overthrew Yeltsin and put Putin in power. And since then, so Putin is not a Democrat. I mean, there are sham elections. There were sham elections in the Soviet Union. Putin's in power because the powerful people in Russia support him. However, they're not the majority. They're simply the people that run crime and run the military and run the Secret Service. But if the Russian people stand up and say no to him, a lot of them will be killed, but they may overthrow him. He can hope. Yeah.
I'd honestly run through a wall for Zelensky. He's an amazing representation of like leading a country through wartime in a crisis.
I've been surprisingly impressed at how, and I've hoped. I told you last week. I hope the Ukrainians fight. They're fighting, and that's an amazing thing to see.
The U.S. went to go pick him up, and he told them, "I need ammunition, not a ride."
Damn straight. Well, no, and they've been rightly critical of our lack of proper response. Were there any other comments, questions, thoughts? Last thing, Haley.
We're still purchasing oil from Russia.
Don't even get me started. Don't even get me started. Bye.
Barrels.
Yeah. Good job.